The tales have been told since man gathered around fire millennia ago. Tales from the west of demon creatures which breathe fire. Tales of gods and dragons granting blessings in the far east. From the dragons whom protect sacred waterways to the great world serpent which brings about Earth's end. From the darkest forests to deep cave dwellings, from snow-topped mountains to the barren deserts washed by the sands of time. Stories have been told of the dragons man must face to gain power, riches, and reward. But at what cost? How have the legends of great dragons endured so long? In this series, we'll investigate the legends of dragons and how they've come to affect mankind. Our curiosity, our beliefs, our courage, and why dragons still hold our fascination today. Once, there were dragons. As the old king remembered the battles of his youth with the Grendel and the Grendel's mother, disturbing news reached his kingdom. Beowulf calls upon his men to gather and prepare for another adventure. The thick black smoke is a warning of danger to the kingdom. Men, remain here as I scout the dragon's dwelling. And Wiglaf, be ready if the demonic beast should appear. Wiglaf rushes in to fight beside his king, attacking the dragon without fear. The old king pulls a dagger from his belt with labored breath. He plunges the short dagger into the dragon's side with a great yell. The battle is over. Wiglaf searches for his lord and pulls Beowulf to safety. The old king falls to the ground. The dragon's poison is too much. Wiglaf, go and inspect the dragon's den. Bring back some treasure for me to see. Wiglaf descends into the dragon's den, and he sees riches beyond his imagination. Jewels, coins, gold. Beowulf, struggling to breathe, tries to speak, but can only whisper, "Thank you, my good and heavenly lord, for my people's prosperous future." As Beowulf lays struggling to speak, he mutters out, "Men, build a barrow in this place for me, so people can come to remember their king." The poison from the dragon's puncture wound is too much for the old king. Beowulf reaches to his bloodied neck and removes the king's collar. Beowulf gives the collar to faithful Wiglaf. The old king quietly passes on. The saga of Beowulf is an ancient tale set in Scandinavia and first translated into Old English between 700 and 1000 AD. Humankind has always told stories. Stories of good and evil, of great deeds and horrible plots. Stories of humanity and the great unknown. Stories are a way we share lessons of wisdom, morality, and courage. The climax between the hero and enemy is often the most exciting part, especially when the tale involves fighting a dragon. What do dragons symbolize in European mythology?
Well, I think most dragon myths in Europe, when you look at the stories, the dragon is the antagonist, the thing that has to be conquered, and then you have this hero figure who's come along to do it, and generally a masculine figure. So Beowulf is a very nice example of where the hero goes through many trials and tribulations, and the dragon is one of the biggest trials that he faces and has to kill the dragon.
The hero Beowulf, he's become king of Geatland, which is southern Sweden, and he's now 60, 70 or something, and he has to fight a dragon. Beowulf's encounter with the dragon is in a way, it's a confrontation with death, basically. Death is the great maw that chews us all up.
The dragon is almost always something to be dominated, killed. He's a challenge that a hero has to overcome.
Dragons in European folklore are often painted as the threat. What is the purpose of the dragon in the Beowulf saga?
Beowulf wants to take this dragon the way he took the other monsters, but he's so old now. He goes in by himself. He can't do it by himself. Wiglaf comes in to help him, and they manage to kill the dragon, but then Beowulf dies. And it's really left really open at the end. The very last word in the poem is Lofeornest, which means most desirous of praise, which is applied to Beowulf. The fact that Beowulf was so eager for fame meant that he went in and tried to kill this dragon alone, which was not a good idea, and he couldn't do it, and it killed him. So there's a kind of irony or kind of sadness or complexity to his encounter with the most primitive beast.
In European folklore, dragons are portrayed in many forms. When you picture a dragon, what image appears in your mind?
So Carl Sagan actually posited that all mammals, and particularly humans, have an innate fear of reptiles that's just hardwired into us evolutionarily.
Serpents are scary. We think, best guess for multi-headed dragons and serpents is that people kept finding pits of brand new cobras, and you get a bunch of those heads sticking up.
The way that snakes interact with the environment impacts the way that we see them, because they're typically associated with water in a lot of cultures. And water is the necessary ingredient for life. It's essential to our life, but it's also quite scary for people. We can't exist in the water except for very limited times. There are places in the ocean we know less about than we know about the surface of the moon. So I think that's another part of the fear that comes with it. The bat-type wings that have been added onto dragons in Europe also has to do with the fact that bats are in an environment that we're not so comfortable with. They're somewhat unpredictable in their flight patterns, which is unnerving to humans. The natural environment of the animal plays into why we might have some discomfort or fear around it.
Any large creatures that had great might, whether they be sea creatures like whales, they seem to represent either something godly, some sort of power, or some wrath. The dragon are often presented in stories as characters that have come to take, to sort of reap and pillage and destroy. And I think that probably just the representation of natural menace, that there are creatures out there that could, if they want to, destroy your ship and everybody on it, or come and take your livestock and destroy your ability to survive winters and whatnot. It seems to be this representation of natural wrath.
It's got the teeth, it's got the claws, it can fly, it can breathe fire. I mean, what else? And it's big. I mean, it can not just kill you, it can kill your whole village. And so the dragon grew in notoriety, I guess, as being the ultimate beast.
Our primeval fear of the unknown evokes great images of ferocious dragons that are found throughout history. How does the Beowulf saga survive centuries of change in Europe?
The only copy of Beowulf that we have is from about the year 1000. It's in the British Library, and it's been through a fire. It's been through over 1,000 years of history. Scholars think that the actual story comes from the 8th century. So we have about 2 centuries of oral tradition and maybe earlier written copies. It looks like we get basically what was originally like a Scandinavian story, because it's all set in Denmark and Sweden. These people had come over to the east coast of England and settled there and started finally to speak Anglo-Saxon, because the poem's in Anglo-Saxon. And so they probably brought this legend with them. And then all of England was gradually Christianized from the 7th century. These people were there who were telling the story. They got Christianized, but the story was older than that. So when you actually read Beowulf as it is, or a translation, you see 2 different worldviews going on. And one that sort of motivates the people in the story is weird, W-Y-R-D, which is our modern word, weird, like that's weird. And it actually means fate. So some strong, anonymous force of entropy that just grinds everyone down. And as Beowulf says at some point, the only thing you can do, or the only thing you can look forward to, is to leave a good name behind you, is to do great deeds and be famous.
Beowulf's fate is tied to his battle with the dragon. How has the fate of the Beowulf saga changed with Christianity?
And meanwhile, obviously Christianity has intervened. The very fact it gets written down implies an educated person, which would probably mean a monk. Probably a monk who was used to writing in Latin and decided he'd write this thing down in his native Anglo-Saxon. So it makes a very interesting tension. And there was a lot of debate about, was it a Christian who originally produced the poem? Was it a pagan? That it's a Christian looking back at pagan times with a kind of respect for that time period and a sort of sorrow for the fact that they knew no other fate.
I think the purpose of dragons for our ancestors was to teach lessons and tell people what their place is and the way they should behave.
After surviving over 1,000 years of cultural changes, why is Beowulf's dragon still important in today's society?
Some of the dragons over time in Eastern Europe changed. Everything's always changing. Human narrative is that we need to explain the unknown. And so these stories of monsters of supernatural power develop. And just over the last 100, 200 years, they all get classified as dragons.
Today, dragons can be found in books, board games, movies, video games, and children's toys. Dragons are creatures of fairy tales and make-believe, not the monsters of folklore and legend which killed men in fire. A search online will provide an instant answer to nearly any question. As we look for answers in books, we also find dragons. What is the purpose and meaning of dragons in literature?
I think for some people, they're outright source material to take and kind of remix in new ways. Tolkien certainly did that. I think they're inspiring. I think they make you consider what the moral of the story is, the theme of overcoming a challenge, the theme of conflict with nature. So I think writers can take those themes and they might do something dragon-centered. They might do something different in fantasy or sci-fi. And I think that a lot of people also wanted a return to dragons that are not inherently evil, bad, and have to be dominated. So I think over the last 50 to 100 years, you've seen people move away from the dragon as purely evil and say, what else could we do with it? Could we take it out of this very European Western framework and move it in a different direction, more like some other cultures have done, or just do something new and exciting with it?
Tolkien basically invented, for the modern world, the fantasy genre. He starts with The Hobbit, as we know, and it's got hobbits all the way through, but instead of just kind of a there and back again kind of story where it's all sort of fun and everyone gets away with everything, it becomes much more serious, and to him it's turned into The Lord of the Rings. Smaug is a combination of Beowulf's dragon and this other dragon from a Norse saga called Volsunga Saga. Beowulf's dragon is more famous. There are things like Smaug and Bilbo because we encounter Beowulf's dragon sitting on a huge pile of treasure. And what's aroused this dragon, which otherwise would have slept away for centuries, is that an escaped slave has stumbled upon this cave holding the dragon and the treasure. And then the dragon wakes up and instantly misses something and flies out and spews fire and starts destroying Beowulf's kingdom. That is Smaug in a lot of ways, and Bilbo is the one stealing the cup. Tolkien has said in his article, The Monsters and the Critics, there are only two really good dragons in medieval literature. And so he put the two of them together, and it really integrated completely into the story. And he combines that kind of bestiality of the Beowulf's dragon with the cleverness and the verbal skills of the Norse dragon.
The Icelandic Volsunga saga tells of a tale involving a greedy dragon named Fafnir and the young hero named Sigurd. Sigurd represents the curiosity, innocence, and humility of human nature. As he grows, Sigurd comes to represent the connection between humanity and the wild, untamed world. The villain facing Sigurd in the Volsunga saga is a creature named Fafnir. He murdered his own father and stole the family treasure, now hoarding the riches deep within a cavern in the mountains. Over time, Fafnir's greed turned him into a dragon. The European dragon is consumed by lust for riches and treasure, the direct opposite of a good and generous ruler. A kind ruler would gather riches and wealth in order to share resources among their people so they may survive. Sigurd observes Fafnir's patterns, seeing the dragon slither among the ground to reach the river in order to drink every day. Finding his opportunity, he hides in a ditch below Fafnir's path. At the right moment, Sigurd strikes from below and stabs Fafnir. The dragon dies slowly. We come to see how Tolkien pulled inspiration for his own creature in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, using the dragon as an analogy for human greed, avarice, and vice. Why have dragons become so popular in our culture today?
By the time the late 50s, early 60s rolled around, everything on Earth just about had been explored. There wasn't much being done about dragons, period, up before Dungeons & Dragons, really. And then they weren't on TV, they weren't in movies, they weren't in books. Dungeons & Dragons were created, and it was gaming, fantasy. And what inspired Gary Gygax to make D&D is he'd read Lord of the Rings, sometimes in the 70s. And I thought, so you could have a dragon as a friend, that would be cool, you know. In gameplay or something, you could talk to dragons. I think that a lot of people didn't realize, even with Dungeons & Dragons, the first dragons in there, the game were really based on what I'd say legend put the size of a real dragon. They weren't that huge. You know, you got millions of kids that grew up in the 80s playing Dungeons & Dragons. And it's sold more last year than it ever has. The experience of playing that game, and there'll be dragons in it probably, because that's like a big thing. You don't want to just go fight a dragon unless you're ready. I mean, you never thought about trying to kill or slay a dragon until you try to do it through the game. And a game is like a soap opera, and it continues, and you got a character you have invested time into. You don't want them to die. And it takes a whole group to fight. I mean, they're strong and powerful, and I think that's how they should have been. I always looked upon them, they're very strong and powerful beasts, and I always look at them basically as evil. You might run into a few that might be good or, you know, neutral, but I wouldn't trust one. Right now, the use for dragons mainly show up in entertainment. Books, movies, art, games, they found a place there. I think we'll just find better ways of making them real.
How were dragons portrayed in today's media?
The idea of having a dragon in film and storytelling it touches upon something that at its core is very wish-fulfilling. The idea of a powerful beast as an ally and a protector, and a creature that could carry you up into the clouds and experience the world from a whole new point of view. has been something that has grabbed audiences in literature and film for a very long time. What we tried to do was present a variety of personalities and attributes in a group of dragons that were not magically based, that they were here on this earth for a time and they disappeared. And what led to that and whether or not they could come back is something that we toyed with. For our films, we thought we wanted to represent dragons not as magical creatures, but actually an extension of the wild kingdom by borrowing characteristics, both in terms of the design, but also the personality traits of animals we would recognize, whether they be parrots or panthers or walrus, or the list goes on and on. We'd always try to find something that was immediately recognizable and then imbue our particular species with these traits.
If we look at the stories about dragons, whether they're good or bad in pop media, you see the lessons that the authors or the makers of that work are trying to send. So if we look at Tolkien's use of dragons in a negative way, they were associated with greed and power. He was unhappy with the way that society was progressing in terms of people's kind of avarice, right? So he used that to make a point. If we look at something like How to Train Your Dragon, I mean, it's got some really interesting messages about accepting difference, being anti-animal cruelty, things like that. You could read a lot of those messages into it, but the basic message is reaching out to something very different you were taught to hate.
Most every other depiction where you have a dragon that has some sort of symbiotic connection with their human rider, they often speak, they often have some magical abilities, and that's something that we consciously departed from because we wanted our dragons to just feel like you could discover one in the woods. You could come upon them and not have to rely upon magic to do so.
Dragons have flown the skies throughout time immemorial. Storytellers from the literary and media worlds continue to be inspired by dragons. Dragons have helped us explore the origins of the unknown that surrounds us. There are many lenses to examine the roots of the dragon's meaning and origin.
We've always got to have a monster.
We've all got fear. We've all got the unknown. The human narrative is that we need to explain the unknown.
These great beasts have this ability to either breathe cloud or fire. It just captures human imagination regardless of where you are.
The idea of the great and powerful dragon, which our hero must face, is eternal. The realm of dragons is just as great and vast as human history. In the depths of human imagination, there are many more dragon tales to tell. We can only imagine how our perceptions of dragons will change with the next generation of storytellers.